I remember sitting at the dinner table every night, the smell of whatever my dad had cooked clinging to the air, heavy and almost suffocating, and watching him shovel food onto his plate as if he were the only one who mattered, his fork clinking against the ceramic in a rhythm that somehow made me feel invisible, because every night my plate stayed empty and he never noticed. It wasn't that he was cruel or angry, at least not in ways I could recognize at the time, but he was so absorbed in his own world, in the way the beans smelled or the way the potatoes were perfectly salted, that I might as well have been a ghost sitting across from him, because I could move my fork 100 times, scrape the last bit of sauce into a neat pile, and he would never glance up, never ask if I was hungry, never notice the silence I carried with me into that room as though it were another dish on the table, one that I had no choice but to swallow nightly along with the invisible meal. I tried to understand why he couldn't see me, why my mother didn't intervene, why my siblings, sometimes distracted by their own plates, seemed to blend into the background like shadows that could disappear without anyone blinking, and I learned to make myself small, to keep my hands folded, to swallow my voice, because if you don't speak up in a house like mine, the world simply moves on without you. And maybe that's what I understood about my dad's nightly rituals, the way he would sit there, talking about work, about bills, about something I didn't care to understand yet, the way he would savor every bite of the beans he loved, and I would stare down at my empty plate thinking that maybe one day someone would notice, maybe one day someone would ask, maybe one day I wouldn't have to feel like I was waiting for permission to exist in a room I had no choice but to occupy. Sometimes I wondered if he even remembered my name at the table, if he remembered the small victories I tried to claim. Silently, like finishing my homework without complaint, helping my siblings without being asked, or making a joke that made everyone else laugh. Yet he never paused mid-chew to look at me, to connect, to acknowledge that I was there, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice the way my stomach ached not just from hunger, but from invisibility, from the knowledge that my presence at the table meant nothing to the one person I hoped it would matter most to, and I started inventing excuses to fill the silence, pretending my plate had food, pretending I wasn't hungry, pretending that the gnawing emptiness was normal because admitting it felt like admitting failure, like saying I mattered less than beans. And sometimes I would watch him laugh at his own stories, crumbs clinging to the corners of his mouth, and I hated him for it and loved him for it all at once. Because love doesn't disappear just because it's ignored, and I wanted so badly for someone, anyone, to see me, to ask if I was okay, to notice that my plate was still clean while his was piled high, and I began to memorize the patterns. The way he always reached for more beans first, the way he never touched the vegetables, the way his fork moved in arcs that left no room for noticing me, and I started timing my swallowing, hoping to make my existence less of a disturbance, hoping to sneak into the family without being detected. And yet the emptiness persisted, until it became a quiet rhythm of my own. An unspoken understanding that dinner was a performance I had to endure, a ritual of watching someone else consume what I longed for, not just food, but acknowledgement, attention, and a sense that I belonged somewhere at that table, somewhere in that family, and I began to internalize the lesson that if you wait long enough, maybe no one will see you at all, but at least you'll survive. At least you'll still be there, still breathing, still hoping that someday someone's eyes will lift from there beans and notice that your plate has always been empty, and that maybe, just maybe, you've been hungry in more ways than they'll ever understand. At school, I carried the same emptiness with me, pretending that the cafeteria food was enough, pretending that the laughs I forced with friends masked the hollow feeling inside, pretending that I was normal while my chest ached in ways no one could see. And I began to notice that I was always looking for attention in the smallest ways, a nod from a teacher, a compliment on a drawing, a simple, "How are you?" that never came, and each small interaction felt monumental because at home, no one seemed to care, and I began to think that maybe the lesson my dad was teaching without meaning to was that people only notice what they want to notice, that love isn't automatic, that sometimes you have to carve it out, demand it, or go without. I became quiet, observant, learning the subtle signs of when it was safe to speak, and when it wasn't, learning to move around the house like a shadow, learning that the world could ignore you, and yet you could still survive if you were careful. And I carried that lesson into friendships, into school, into life, always hoping for recognition, always aching for acknowledgement, always remembering those nights at the dinner table, the beans and the potatoes, the sounds of chewing that echoed louder than words, the laughter that never included me, the silence that pressed down like a weight I couldn't shake. And I realized as I grew older that the empty plate was never about the food itself, but about the quiet truth of feeling unseen, about the long, slow ache of being overlooked by someone whose attention you craved most. And sometimes even now, years later, I can smell beans and feel the same hollow ache, remembering how small I felt, how I learned to disappear into the background, how I learned to wait and hope that someone, anyone, would finally notice that I existed. And while I survived, while I became someone capable and competent and even loved by others, a part of me will always remember that empty plate, and I wonder if my dad ever realizes what he missed, what he failed to see, or if he even remembers those nights, the tiny human across from him who sat so quietly, invisible yet present, wishing more than anything to simply be seen. And as I entered high school, that invisible thread of longing followed me into the hallways where I laughed with friends but kept my voice just slightly quieter than everyone else's, where I helped classmates with homework but never asked for help myself, where I excelled academically but never felt the pride reflected back at home. And I began to notice the subtle ways my dad continued his oblivion into the teenage years, never asking about school projects, never noticing when I stayed up late to perfect a paper, never commenting on achievements that anyone else would have praised. And I realized that his attention was never something I could count on, so I learned to internalize success, to be my own cheerleader, to measure my worth internally, and yet the ache of that empty plate lingered like a faint hum. Beneath everything else, a reminder of how long it takes to feel truly seen, and how sometimes survival means pretending to be fine, even when your chest feels hollow, even when every day you wonder if the people who are supposed to notice you are even capable of seeing you at all. And I carried that lesson into friendships, into jobs, into my first heartbreaks, into relationships where I overcompensated with attention and care because I never wanted anyone to feel unseen like I had. And yet, there was always that echo of the dinner table, that rhythm of empty plates and unheeded presence that made me pause, reflect, and sometimes ache in ways words can't contain, until I began to write down my thoughts, to pour into pages the silent yearning I carried for decades, to finally acknowledge the small child who sat quietly under the gaze of someone who never truly looked. And as I wrote, I realized that while I could never reclaim those empty plates, I could honor them. I could honor myself. I could finally give voice to the invisible, to the unnoticed, to the quiet hunger that shaped my life in ways both painful and profound. And maybe that was enough. Maybe seeing myself clearly, understanding the depth of my own longing, was the first step toward healing, toward acknowledging that the empty plate was more than just a meal missed. It was a lesson in resilience, in observing without losing yourself, in surviving invisibility, and in carrying forward a compassion for others who, like me, sat quietly hoping to be seen, hoping to be recognized, hoping that someday, somewhere, someone's eyes would finally lift and notice that for decades, a small person had existed at the edge of awareness, fully present yet fully unseen, and that acknowledgement, even in memory, could finally fill a little of the emptiness left behind.